is good enough for the delivery mechanism. But in some of those which are run by charities or the Red Cross, Red Crescent organization or whoever else, it's not easy. So there is a lot of financial engineering to be done. Those of you who are financial engineers might have to look at it in the next 10 years. Generally speaking, this mix between sustainability and investment sense is quite a complex circle. And that's where I think the challenges will come. My question, Professor Paul Palmer, to you is, at the moment, there is not much competition from the commercial sector for this, right? As these other parameters come into play, which Simon was outlining, and all kinds of needs, a lot of corporate entities will come into this space to deliver renewability, this, that, all kinds of things. Will they crowd out the charities and say, go home, we will deliver it? Can we make this mic work, please? Yeah, it's working.
It's on. I think it is crucial that the social investors are found, but it's very much a new market, certainly for what I do in the capital markets. But I think what we're hearing is that this is an absolutely growing area. And if you're saying that your potential return is, say, 10%, and you're going to achieve a social good, and you're being asked by your regulators to set out what socially responsible investments you are making, that does begin to create a universe of potential investors who would be interested in a product like this. So I think we're at the beginning of it, but if these transactions are successful, then you can see it growing, and there does seem to be certainly a demand from the investing public that this kind of investment is available beyond the regular investment. So it probably won't happen overnight, and I suspect that there's a world of difference between the kind of bond that Garvey issues, which is very large, very tradable, very public, and some of the much smaller social impact bonds we've seen in the market, which have been, £5-6 million worth. So, we're at the beginning, and the market will find a way. But what I have found encouraging so far is that whether it is the $100 million bond or the £5 million bond, at the moment we're seeing this market come into being, and we are seeing investors. And it's just a question of how quickly it grows from that.
So to pick up the two points I think you raised. The first one I mentioned earlier was about understanding risk. And the first one then to overcome the barrier of risk has been the decline, as I mentioned earlier, of grants. So I think what you have to understand, and I think this is the biggest problem actually for the social investment market, is if you want to encourage charitable organisations, social care organisations, to come in, you're going to have to provide some form of risk-free capital. In other words, the ability, and what struck me about every single government initiative of the UK government over the last 15 years in this area, is that nobody is prepared to say, we may have to write off some of this money. There might be failure. Well, if you go into the venture capital world or whatever, the write-offs there are phenomenal. Yet nobody is prepared to do the same because they assume it's taxpayers' money and whatever. There has to be an understanding of risk, that not all of these things are always going to work, and who is therefore going to bear it. And if you want to encourage this market, then government or philanthropy in relation to foundations, you mentioned the Gates Foundation, whatever, have got to bite the bullet and accept that they're going to have to put in some form of grant finance in there to get this thing taken off. And that has been, in my view, the major barrier to date. To answer your question on crowding out, I think I'd cite two sources of evidence to suggest what happens. So first off, within the UK, in the elderly persons market, we have seen a total collapse of commercial providers in this area.
old age care.
In old age, yeah.
Yeah.
Southern Cross, whatever, right? There has been a total collapse in that market because they've not been able to get it to work because they've worked to a pure commercial model, okay? The second side of it is if you actually look at attitudes. So if we go to Free America, right? Marvellous research been done on elderly people in America, right? And they were given 3 choices of who could look after you in your old age. The government, the commercial sector, right? And they decided to choose a well-known agency in America, a charity, and they said, or the Salvation Army, right? Overwhelmingly, Americans of all classes, of all income groups, elected the Salvation Army to be the organisation that they actually would most like to look after them, right? The commercial and the government came very poorly second and third. So I think we also have to understand that there is an ethical and moral underpinning to these issues that are very rarely explored. And actually one of the great problems in this debate has been, and I think you raised it right at the beginning, when you said that people feel very uneasy in this area ethically for some reasons. The ethical argument, right, as to why the charitable voluntary sector would be the best ones to do this, but understanding then the risk-return issues, right, is still not fully understood, and that's what needs to happen. And that goes back to my problem, which is that was once expressed to me by David Carrington, who was director of the Bearing Foundation at one time, when he said, why is it, Paul, that the people who come in asking for the money don't wear closed shoes, and the ones who are given the money do have closed shoes? And until we sort the shoe problem out, we're not going to sort out the other problems.
Okay, questions? Yes, Azman.
Professor Paul Palmer, your critical but witty remarks and comments have inspired me, and definitely you are better than many stand-up comedians, and you can be a good coach to the youngsters, excellent coach. And basically, I remember a book written by one of our greatest scholars about creative constructive ijtihad, and you. I would say is an epitome. Unfortunately, you are not a Muslim, but I can see that in you. And I would like to learn a lot. And if I were to write a book on Islamic economics, definitely I would incorporate all what you have said. But unfortunately, I tried to Google and couldn't download any of your conference papers, especially the one in Kuala Lumpur that you presented. So how do I get some or all of some of your papers?
Okay. Well, if you just simply Google Centre for Charity Effectiveness, and that should come up, Cass Business School. That will take you into the CCE subsection of the Cass Business School website. Yeah, you should be. I'm just wondering if you're trying to do it. It might be that it's. I know there are issues. I'm looking at Mez over there. I know there are issues if you're trying to download on a mobile that the university is moving its technology to this mobile, so that might be a problem. If you have got a problem, just email me. Good old-fashioned email will do, and then I'll put you and I'll just have it sent to you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Iqbal? Sajjad, give it to
Thank you to all the panelists for your wonderful presentations. My question is to Professor Palmer and Farmida. Firstly, Professor Palmer, you absolutely state that there is risk for trustees in trying to rethink the way in which they do the charity, and subsequently, of course, that risk requires some sort of a mitigation. But what we often find is that these exact same trustees, when they put their business hats on, are more than happy to take their risk in the private sector, but not happy to do it in the public sector. So certainly there is some sort of a cognitive dissonance, if you will, in that particular understanding. But my question is more to make and to be a little bit more pragmatic. Could there be some sort of insurance or financial products that could be structured to be able to allow the trustees to be able to take that risk and in much smaller quantities, and therefore protect themselves or the institutions that they serve in such a way that they don't need to burden that risk onto the charity, if you will?
Exactly, and that's where I said that the products have been created by the supply side. So, you know, I've often argued this against Ron E. Cohen and others, you know, pioneers in this industry, that they very much just focused on the supply side with the assumption if you provided the products, then people would take them. This was also assumed against an environment of the austerity environment of government, that at the time, that as government, the UK government, so if you look at the biggest decline in voluntary sector income for the sector over the last 5 years, it's been by government, and particularly by central government. And the assumption was, therefore, that there would be a credit squeeze, and therefore the supply side assumption was that this money would flow in because these organisations would desperately seek these other sources of finance. What's actually happened is they've just curtailed their activities. So basically, all that's happened, and this is why, of course, we are now facing, so if we look at, for example, the number of people homeless on the streets, if we look at the issues around the UK that has in social care and whatever, it's simply because, right, that credit squeeze has not happened that they've all gone and sought this other finance, they've just cut back on their activities. And that has been the unintended consequence of what's happened there. The law of unintended outcomes is always an interesting one. So the short answer is that I think the industry, and we've got two proponents of the industry here, right, need in one sense to rethink their products to exactly bring up that point about understanding the risk factor. Why would you? I'm a charity trustee of a number of charities, right, and that issue always comes up about potential personal liability, right, and that issue. When I chaired the Royal Society for Public Health a few years ago. I always say this when I do trustee training. When you're given the Royal Charter, and the Royal Charter has Florence Nightingale, Edward Chadwick and other names on it, the first thing that comes to you as the President of a Royal Society is, this is not going to go under my watch. And that is inevitably builds in a degree of conservatism. And then the final anecdotal story I'll share with you, and I'm probably going to get me into terrible trouble for saying this, is I think most people have heard of Lord Sugar, Alan Sugar. Lord Sugar is phenomenally great at telling people you're fired on his television programme. And he's also a great advocate, and that's why it features every time, for Great Ormond Street. But all I will say is a number of people have said, of trustees at Great Ormond Street have said to me, and this is going to get me into terrible trouble here, of saying, we really would like Alan to sometimes say, you're fired and be tough with us, instead of being such a nice guy. So I'll leave you with that thought as well, about the businessman problem when they become, we call it the revolving door problem. They go, you want this really aggressive business person, and they go through the door, and they suddenly become, tickle my tummy, and that's a real problem.
Okay, last question here, Sujat, and then we can move
on. Thank you all for your presentations. My question is actually to Simon Howard. So you showed us some statistics on that YouGov poll. My question is around, is there any other data for that specific poll in terms of how much wealth these individuals have in terms of, because we know that there's a concentration of wealth. So yes, there may be a move towards people wanting to do things more responsibly and kind of not just being about the money, but actually do they have the wealth, and then is there any action around that? So is there an idea, and then is that actually backed up by action?
I have looked at the underlying data, and I don't think attitudes differ by wealth. They do differ by age, which is the point Paul made. The young are far more engaged with this. But I think if there had been any material differences by wealth, I'd have flagged them, because we always look through data looking for the story. And the story, I think, is that society overall appears to be changing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think just one small observation before we break for coffee. Simon mentioned that in many senses, women tend to be more committed to sustainability and so on. We found something parallel when we were doing research on introduction of Islamic financial products in the UK. We did lots of focus groups and surveys. And one of the questions at that time, because it was a new industry and therefore the scale wasn't there, was, will you be prepared to pay a little bit more for this product than a conventional product? And I think at about 2 to 3% more, the men started to fall off. But women who were convinced of the product stayed until 12 to 15% more cost. So I think the commitment seems to be quite serious. If you market it correctly, I think that's where the marketing budget should go rather than on the other side. Okay, with those remarks, let's give a show of hands to the excellent panel. And we have a short coffee break and come back to see how actually investment is done in this space. Thank you very much.